Okay, so I'm Marci Julene. You know me. I'm the author of several books, the founder and CEO of Heart and Mind Ministries, and it's my privilege to get to share with you guys today the research that I've done on grounding. In today's wellness culture, many are turning to grounding, the practice of connecting physically to the Earth's surface. Proponents of grounding, which is also called earthing, say that the practice of physically connecting the human body to the Earth's surface, whether it be through direct contact, such as walking barefoot on grass or soil, or by using special devices like mats, sheets, patches that connect you to the Earth via a grounded electrical outlet or rod, allows the human body to absorb free electrons, which they say then neutralizes free radicals and reduces inflammation. And of course, by reducing inflammation, you relieve pain. So they also claim it improves sleep, it reduces cortisol levels, restores emotional balance, and it's presented as a natural, healing, and by some, a spiritual aligning practice. But our question is it truly supported by science? The Bible tells us in 1 Thessalonians 5:21 and 22 to test all things, hold fast to what is good, and abstain from every form of evil. So in this presentation, we'll explore what does the research actually show and how grounding aligns or conflicts with God's word. As Christians, we're not called to follow every wellness trend, and I know that you know that because you're a part of this group, but we're instead called to walk in truth and discernment. So let's seek clarity so that our health choices and those we recommend to others are rooted not just in what we're told might help, but what is true. Okay, so in this presentation, I'm going to endeavor to separate fact from fiction, starting with the science of electrons as they apply, or as the case may be, have been misapplied to the practice of grounding. When I set out to research grounding, I had numerous questions that you likely also have. And I'm going to seek to answer those questions, such as whether a difference exists between supposed grounding in God's creation, like walking barefoot outside, swimming in a lake, versus sleeping on a grounding mat. What does the research actually say? Are the claims overstated or unsupported? Is there evidence of deception? Are there other more likely explanations than the transfer of electrons through grounding to explain any health benefits that come from being in contact with God's creation? So these are the questions I want to look at, but I'm going to begin with a brief explanation of the nature of electrons. Because I am neither a physicist or a chemist, I will be relying on those who are. Much of what I say in the next two slides, although the information is found in lots of sources spoken by physicists, the next two slides, I'm going to primarily use one source that is an article published in scienceblogs.com by a man named Drorzel, who is a physicist. And his article kind of tells you the direction he's going. It says, "Earthing is a bunch of crap." That's the name of the article. And he begins his article by stating a hallmark of all pseudoscience, not just particular to grounding. He says, "There's a tiny grain of truth at the center of a giant ball of crap." So let's separate fact from fiction, starting with understanding a little bit about electrons. So, first truth. it is true. We can build up potential difference between our bodies and the earth due to brushing against materials that tend to grab electrons. We have all experienced this all the time when you're walking across carpet in a pair of slippers or your socks, and you suddenly reach out and touch a doorknob and there's a shock. That's because of the truth that as we move about, our bodies and materials brush up against things that grab electrons. Okay, so second truth, contact with the earth or with grounded conductors will equalize the potential by allowing electrons to flow from your body and the earth. So both of these things are true. Both are stated when you begin to research grounding. And it's not that there's anything particularly wrong with stating these two facts about electrons. However, they're basically meaningless if you're trying to prove grounding. Let's talk about why. Sites that promote the sale of grounding mats are full of talk about beneficial electrons from the earth and that sort of thing. And Drorsel says this is garbled nonsense because electrons are electrons are electrons. There's nothing that singles out or sets apart an electron from the earth as opposed to an electron from some synthetic material. So whether you get an electron from the ground, the air, or a grounding mat, they are all going to be the same. All electrons are truly identical to a very high degree. If this weren't so, chemistry and physics simply wouldn't work. Drorsel explains this in greater detail, but since this isn't intended to be an in-depth presentation on chemistry, I'm going to just summarize by saying he is correct and the science doesn't dispute this point. God truly did create electrons uniformly, which provides an uncompromising order to the world around us. The Bible speaks in Jeremiah 33:25 of the fixed order of heaven and earth. And the nature of electrons is just one more example in science of that fixed order of heaven and earth. Okay, so next, the proponents of grounding speak of using voltmeters to show how there's a difference between your charge when you're grounded and when you're not. They strongly suggest that through this, I'm sorry, let me just say that again. They strongly suggest that this is a problem, the fact that your body has a different charge in different circumstances, that this is a problem that needs to be fixed by intentionally grounding. But the truth is that potential differences in the charge of your body and the earth are transient and meaningless. In other words, they don't last. So if you, again, using that example of shuffling your feet across a carpet and then touching that doorknob, what happens? Well, there's a spark and you feel it. Congratulations, you have just established a significant potential difference between yourself and the earth, and then you eliminated it. It's perfectly true that ordinary interactions with materials will strip electrons off your body, but that never lasts all that long, just as the doorknob spark illustrates. In the process of shuffling across a carpeted floor, you lose or gain, depending on the materials involved, several billion electrons. But the moment you touch that metal object, you get them all back or you give them all up. It's simply not possible to build up and maintain a significant charge imbalance between your body and the rest of the world, because everything we interact with contains electrons, including the air around us. And those electrons move back and forth between objects all the time. If nothing else, the charge on an object will eventually dissipate even into the air. A net positive charge will attract negative ions from the air and eventually neutralize. And the same thing happens to our bodies. Now, Drorsel, states that anyone who has spent any time playing with voltmeters will learn that they always have a measure of noise and that noise, which is just a slight fluctuation caused by various things, but it's always there. To the unknowing observer, it can be misconstrued as something meaningful, but it's not. I read in an article by two proponents of grounding named Oshman and Chevalier how they go into great detail about how they used a voltmeter to test a person when sitting by various electric devices and how the charge significantly changed where they moved about the room. Drorsel said that he has spent much time using a voltmeter as a physicist and has never been able to recreate the differences that these proponents claim in their websites. And he suggests that something is being done to create the situation of a significant difference in charges that are being reported. But regardless, going back to what we were just saying a moment ago, regardless, because it is impossible to maintain a significant imbalance of electrons between your body and the rest of the world, the reading on a voltmeter is completely meaningless. Okay, so the final kicker comes in the last truth statement on the slide that you're looking at. Grounding devices claim to include a resistor as a safety precaution. And I'm going to show you just two examples from three of the most prominent proponents of grounding. Clint Ober, who is credited as, behind this whole theory, and then Oshman and Chevalier. And most of the studies are somehow connected to them. But on their websites describing their products, you can see for Clint Ober, it says that in addition, all Earthling products cords have built-in 100,000 ohm resistors, providing protection against potential errant voltage. And then from Oshman and Chevalier's article on grounding, they speak of the Better Earthing product, which has a 50,000 ohm safety resistor. Because these companies don't wish to be sued in case someone was electrocuted while in contact with their device, they contain significant resistors as a precaution. So why does this matter? Going back to that third truth statement. It matters because it's important to know that the definition of a resistor is that it resists the flow of current, which means it will impede the flow of harmful current from a faulty appliance or an electric storm, if the lightning struck the ground or the house. That sounds like a really good safety measure, don't you think, to include in an electrical mat that you're going to have people lay on? The problem is this. The resistor will also act to impede the flow of beneficial electrons from the Earth by exactly the same amount. So what does that mean? It means the connection between the ground plug of your electrical system and the actual ground, generally either a metal spike driven into the ground or something like a metal water pipe coming into the house, it should have a resistance of just a few ohms. But if you put 100,000 ohm resistor in there, you're increasing the resistance by nearly a factor of 100,000, which reduces the rate at which electrons flow in from the Earth by the same factor. So, in order to get the same health benefit that you would get if you step outside your house onto the ground with your bare feet for 1 second, it would take you 100,000 seconds to lay on a grounding mat with a 100,000 ohm resistor mat. Let me put that in context. 100,000 seconds is about 27 hours, which is more than you could do if you laid on it all day long. Their literature talks about the health benefits of multiple hours spent on earthing mats, which would require hundreds of thousands of hours on the protected mat. And 100,000 hours is over 11 years. So their safety precaution completely obliterates any potential effectiveness of their device. I tell the story in my book, Ouija Medicine, The Dark Side of Energy Medicine, of how a doctor named Elisha Perkins manufactured a device in 1796 called metallic tractors. And these devices supposedly brought significant relief from joint pain and all other manner of conditions. There were two metal rods, one brass and one iron. They were about the size of fingers. And they were based on experiments that were done by Volta. Recognize that name, Volta, from voltmeters and voltage. All one had to do was place the rods on opposite sides of the problem area, and voila, the symptoms would supposedly cease. And in spite of the $25 price tag, which is $500 in today's money, they became all the rage. Even President George Washington owned a set. But then Dr. John Haygarth conducted a controlled study to test the effectiveness of Perkins metallic tractors for rheumatic pain. He first treated 5 patients using wooden replicas, which the patients believed were real. So this was a single-blind study of just 5 people. And they reported pain relief lasting several hours. The next day, they came back and he used the metal tractors on the same patients, but they didn't know that he was now using the real thing, not the wooden thing. Only he knew. So again, they reported the same kind of results of relief from pain that lasted X number of hours, etc. So Haygarth published his results in a newspaper, and I want you to see his concluding comment. He says, "This method of discovering the truth succinctly proves to what a surprising degree mere fancy deceives the patient himself. And if the experiment had been tried with metallic tractors only, they might and most probably would have deceived even medical observers." You know, the placebo effect is a very powerful reality, and it must be taken into account when considering health claims. When you begin to research grounding, you find a handful of individuals whose names are connected with the bulk of the research. 2 of those names, as I already mentioned, are Oshman and Chevalier. Clint Ober's another one. Both of whom, Oshman and Chevalier in particular, are major proponents of energy medicine and frequency medicine. If you see their names attached to anything, that's a major red flag to be aware of. They wrote a lengthy review of the supposed science behind grounding, and one of the studies that they touted as proof that laying on grounding mats while you sleep helps all kinds of things involved 12 people with no control group or blinding. And I'll show you that study here. It's called The Biologic Effects of Grounding the Human Body During Sleep as Measured by Cortisol Levels and Subjective Reporting of Sleep, Pain, and Stress. It tested the cortisol levels of the individuals before the grounding began and after 6 weeks of use. The conclusion states that the individual's cortisol levels were significantly improved, as was the quality of sleep. As a side note, they also made a note that the majority of the participants were women. Now, the problem is that this study was ripe for the placebo effect. Hopefully you can see that after, now that we've talked about the Perkins tractors. Because of the placebo effect, this study, the data is completely meaningless. Studies that don't have a control group and aren't blind should be discarded. If these individuals are told laying on a grounding mat's going to help you sleep better, that has a profound impact. Science proves that over and over again, that the placebo effect is just so powerful. And so these results accomplish nothing except that they add to the studies that proponents of grounding can deceptively cite as showing positive results. And that brings me to another common tactic used in the promotion of pseudoscience that I just want to highlight, where you take a kernel of truth and you surround it with a mountain of distractions. I already discussed some of those kernels of truth associated with grounding, but proponents also like to create a scientific sounding sense of overwhelm. Have you ever seen a courtroom drama where the opposing attorneys bury the evidence during the discovery process in a truckload of paperwork? The truth is in there, they know it, but they're hoping that all the meaningless paperwork will overwhelm and distract. That is also often a tactic that's used in pseudoscience, and it's done by Oshman and Chevalier in a review, a very lengthy review that sounds incredibly scientific, that they co-authored to convince people that there is abundant scientific proof for grounding when there is not. And the study I just shared with you is just one of many examples like that. Those of you who are familiar with my writings know that I have spent countless hours researching clinical studies, and in so doing, I've learned what to look for and what things to pay attention to. As you're probably aware from COVID vaccine research, manipulation of data can be manipulated, and it is not uncommon that that is done. However, you have also seen through COVID that peer review eventually brings to light such deceptions, but it often takes time. I've encountered this in a great deal when researching the devices and modalities of frequency and energy medicine. So I just want to share with you one example that I discovered while carefully examining one of the more compelling clinical studies on grounding that was just published in May of 2025. And this study is called, it tested 84 individuals for 2 days following spinal surgery. The individuals were divided into 2 groups, and for 2 days, the control group laid on a grounding mat that wasn't connected and was told they were receiving grounding treatments. So it was a blind experiment, which is good. While the experimental group had the same exact mat, but it was actually connected and provided grounding treatments. Now, the patient's blood was taken and a marker for inflammation was tested. That marker is called CRP. Their pain levels were also monitored, and the results showed conclusively a significant difference in the blood marker for CRP for those in the experimental group, which sounds like a major gain and major win for grounding mats. But it turns out that the group that received the grounding treatments and had lower CRP results were, get this, on average, a decade younger than the group who didn't receive treatments. It's a well-established fact that age has a profound impact on the degree of inflammation and recovery times following surgery. Of course, the experimental group, which ranged in age from 39 to 67 is going to show significantly lower levels of CRP than the control group, which ranged in age from 49 to 71. In clinical studies, earthing as a supportive therapy for post-spinal surgery recovery. I could spend a great deal of time reporting on the various studies that have been done on grounding devices, but because the science of physics and chemistry contradict the validity of such devices in the first place, and the clinical evidence that I've highlighted doesn't support it, I'm going to move on now to answering the question that may be on your minds, and that's whether grounding in God's creation, like walking barefoot outside, is shown to be different than sleeping on a grounding mat. So let's consider two studies that were done in Korea that compare measurable health markers from barefoot walkers and sneaker walkers. So, effects of barefoot walking in urban forest on CRP and interferon gamma, which is a cytokine, a signaling protein that plays a critical role in the immune system, particularly in the body's defense against viruses, certain bacteria, and cancer. And it's often used as a marker of natural killer cell activity. And then the third thing they tested was serotonin levels. There were 62 adults divided into sneaker wearing and barefoot groups. The study found that barefoot walking began decreasing CRP after 10 weeks of walking, and interferon gamma changed from the beginning of the experiment in both groups and did not change significantly after the middle of the experiment. So the second half, that's initial benefit and then no more increase in benefit between both groups. But the significant difference was serotonin showed the most noticeable improvement and was significantly higher in the barefoot group. So in conclusion, it appears that barefoot walking improves certain measures of health more than walking in shoes. Now, the final study I want to show you is also done in Korea, but it focused on adolescent boys in particular, and it was also done in Korea. This time, they divided the boys into 3 groups. There was 19 to 20 individuals in each group. There was a control group, which performed self-study while the other groups walked. So there was a sneaker group and a barefoot group. They walked 40 minutes 4 times a day for 12 weeks. And in this study, rather than measuring blood work or saliva, they used EEGs, and they measured the boys' brain activity before and after the exercise program. The results showed that after 12 weeks, the beta and alpha waves of the adolescent males in the walking groups showed marked improvement from the self-study control group, which is no surprise. When you get them outside and doing something physical, there's going to be health benefits. The barefoot group, though, in particular, showed a significant increase in cognitive speed and concentration and a significant decrease in brain stress. So that's all really interesting, I think, and worth noting. And it shows a difference between the direct contact, the barefoot walking versus wearing shoes. Now, despite the results from these 2 studies, which sought to consider the possible benefits of grounding, the concluding discussion stated that the results seen were likely due to factors other than grounding. The main health benefits of walking barefoot in nature are well supported by science, but they are best explained by increased sensory input, improved biomechanics, psychological restoration, increase in circulation, sun exposure, and fresh air, not by electron transfer or grounding effects. Many of the benefits are achieved with or without shoes just by being out in God's creation. However, there are particular benefits to walking barefoot as it powerfully increases sensory feedback to the brain. It improves balance and proprioception. Sensory input from the feet is especially important for children's development, they have found. And this study shows how profound an impact it had on these adolescent boys. Spending time outdoors with or without shoes is linked to reduced stress, improved mood, and lower risk of chronic diseases, independent of grounding. I forgot to switch slides there, but there's the slide on looking at the different benefits from these things. Now, this shouldn't come as any surprise to anyone, but especially to the Christian. As we consider the words of Psalm 23, verses 1-3, it says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake." God brings restoration through contact with his creation. But it's important that we also take notice of verse 3 in that, the last part of it, which says that there's a role of walking in righteousness that also restores the soul. And I would argue is fundamental for that restoration of the soul. So in conclusion, science doesn't support the ideas promoted in grounding. Clinical studies do not support the use of grounding devices. Health benefits are inherent in physically connecting to God's creation, but are most likely due to sensory input, increased circulation, and the sun and air rather than the transfer of electrons. People today are always searching for man-made ways to deal with their health, whether it be by grounding or synthetic substances. Instead, we need to look to the God of creation to restore our souls.